Welcome, restless souls, to Carmen's Crypt. I'm Carmen Carrion, keeper of forgotten tales and curator of nightmares. You've wandered into my domain, where each week I unearth a fresh horror from the depths of human imagination. In these darkened halls, stories wait like hungry shadows. Each tale we've collected whispers of terrors both ancient and new. From crumbling mansions where something skitters behind the walls, to that strange text message you received at 3 a.m. from a number that shouldn't exist. So gather close. The candles are lit, the shadows grow long, and the witching hour is upon us. Are you prepared to face what lurks in the darkest recesses of Carmen's Crypt? Lock your doors, still your nerves, and remember, here, every fear comes to life. This is Carmen's Crypt. Your sanctuary of scares awaits. Morgan hadn't wanted to come back to Clearfield. Not after what happened 20 years ago. But when his Aunt Becky died and left him her farmhouse and her will, he had little choice. Just sell it, his wife Diane had suggested as he packed his suitcase. You don't need to go there at all. Call a realtor and be done with it. That would have been the sensible approach, but Morgan knew he couldn't sell the property without seeing it one last time, without making sure. The 2-hour drive from Pittsburgh to the rural town stretched into 3 as an unexpected spring storm turned the narrow country roads treacherous. By the time Morgan pulled into the long gravel driveway leading to Aunt Becky's farmhouse, heavy clouds had turned the late afternoon nearly as dark as night. The house stood exactly as he remembered it. White clapboard siding now gray with age, a sagging front porch, and shutters hanging at odd angles. Behind it stretched 20 acres of fallow fields that had once grown corn, and beyond that, the dense woods where Morgan and his cousin Travis had played as children. The key was where the lawyer had said it would be, under a flower pot by the back door. Morgan let himself in, the familiar smell of old wood and mothballs washing over him. The electricity had been shut off over a year ago when Aunt Becky moved to the nursing home, but Morgan had come prepared with a battery-powered lantern that cast long shadows through the empty rooms. He would sleep here tonight, he decided, and in the morning he would check the field, just to be certain. Then he could contact the realtor with a clear conscience, sell the property, and never set foot in Clearfield again. Setting his suitcase on the dusty kitchen floor, Morgan opened the refrigerator out of habit, finding it empty and unplugged as expected. From his backpack, he pulled out a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a fifth of whiskey. The sandwich and water were for sustenance. The whiskey was for courage. As he settled into what had once been Aunt Becky's favorite armchair, now draped in a dusty sheet, Morgan's gaze drifted to the window. From this angle he couldn't see the field, but he knew what waited there. His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his left forearm, 3 inches long, ragged at the edges, a souvenir from that summer 20 years ago. The summer they made Callum. It had been Travis's idea. Always Travis with his wild schemes, his reckless dares. I'm bored, Travis had declared one sweltering July afternoon. At 16, Travis was 2 years older than Morgan, and in Morgan's eyes, infinitely wiser in the ways of the world. Let's make a scarecrow. It seemed innocent enough. They gathered old clothes from the attic, Aunt Becky's late husband's overalls, a flannel shirt moth-eaten at the elbows, work boots caked with dried mud. For the head, they used a burlap feed sack, stuffing everything with straw from the barn. But then Travis had taken out his pocket knife. It needs a face, he said, and before Morgan could protest, Travis had cut his own palm, squeezing dark blood onto the burlap. Your turn, Travis had insisted, holding out the knife. He needs to know both of us. Morgan had hesitated. but Travis's scorn was unbearable. "Don't be a baby, it's just a little blood." So Morgan had taken the knife and drawn it across his forearm, deeper than he had intended. The blood had flowed freely, soaking into the rough fabric of the Scarecrow's face. "Now we name him," Travis had said. "He should have a real name, not just Scarecrow." They had settled on Callum, after a character in a horror movie they'd snuck into the previous summer. "Hello, Callum," Travis had whispered to the Scarecrow as they propped him up in the cornfield. "Guard our crops. Watch over this field." That night, Morgan had awoken to the sound of Travis sneaking out of the bedroom they shared. Through the window, Morgan had watched his cousin cross the yard and enter the cornfield. Curious, he had followed at a distance. In the center of the field, Travis stood before Callum, speaking in a low voice. Morgan couldn't make out the words, but there was an intensity to Travis's posture that made him uneasy. Then Travis had taken out his knife again, cutting his palm anew, and pressed the bleeding wound against the burlap face. Morgan had retreated to the house, pretending to be asleep when Travis returned an hour later. The next morning, over breakfast, Morgan had asked casually, "Do you think the Scarecrow is working? Keeping the crows away?" Travis had given him a strange look. "Callum isn't for the crows. He's for watching." "Watching what?" "Everything," Travis had replied. "Everyone." Over the next few days, Morgan noticed changes in the Scarecrow. Though neither he nor Travis had moved it, Callum's head seemed to tilt at a different angle each morning. The button eyes Travis had sewn on appeared to track movements across the field. Once, Morgan could have sworn he saw the rough-sewn mouth twitch into a smile. "Travis," Morgan had said one evening as they sat on the porch, "I think there's something wrong with Callum." Travis had smiled. "He's just getting stronger. I've been feeding him." "Feeding him? It's a Scarecrow, Travis. It's not alive." "Not yet," Travis had replied. "But he will be soon." A week after they created Callum, Aunt Becky's farm cat disappeared. Then the neighbor's dog was found dead at the edge of the property, its body strangely deflated and twisted, as if all the blood had been drained from it. And Callum changed. The burlap face grew taut, taking on the suggestion of features, cheekbones, a nose, thin lips. The straw-filled body seemed more substantial, standing straighter in the field. "What did you do?" Morgan had demanded of Travis, but his cousin had only smiled. "I didn't do anything. Callum did." That night, Morgan had decided to destroy the Scarecrow. He crept out to the field with a gas can and matches, determined to burn Callum to ashes. But as he approached the spot where the Scarecrow stood, he found only an empty pole. Callum was gone. Panicking, Morgan had turned to run back to the house, only to find his path blocked. The Scarecrow stood before him, but it wasn't a scarecrow anymore. Though still roughly formed, with straw protruding from its sleeves and pant legs, it moved like a living thing. The burlap face had split into a grin, revealing teeth, real human teeth, set into crude gums. Morgan had turned to flee, but burlap hands had seized him, surprisingly strong. One hand had covered his mouth, stifling his screams, while the other had pressed something sharp against his already scarred forearm, reopening the wound. What happened next remained a blur in Morgan's memory. He remembered pain and a horrible tearing sensation. He remembered the Scarecrow's face pressed close to his, hot, foul odor pouring from its burlap mouth, and he remembered Travis appearing suddenly, shouting. Morgan had awakened in the hospital 2 days later, diagnosed with severe blood loss and trauma. He had 40 stitches in his forearm from an injury 4 times larger than the original cut. By then, Travis was gone. Aunt Becky would only say that he'd been sent to live with his father in Oregon. She never mentioned the scarecrow, and when Morgan tried to tell the doctors what had happened, they sedated him. Eventually, he stopped talking about it. He left Clearfield as soon as he was old enough, went to college in Pittsburgh, met Diane, and built a normal life. On rare occasions, when he'd had too much to drink, he would tell her fragments of the story, and she would listen patiently before suggesting he might benefit from therapy. But Morgan knew what he had seen, what he had helped create. Now, 20 years later, he sat in his late aunt's house, drinking whiskey straight from the bottle and watching the darkness gather outside. The storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling around the eaves. When the whiskey was half gone, Morgan rose unsteadily and made his way to the mudroom, where he pulled on a raincoat he had found hanging on a hook. He grabbed his lantern and stepped out into the storm. The rain struck his face like needles as he made his way across the yard toward the field. 20 years ago, this had been a thriving cornfield. Now it lay barren, nothing but mud and weeds stretching toward the distant tree line. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the landscape, and Morgan froze. In that instant of harsh white light, he had seen a figure standing in the center of the field. A tall, thin figure that might have been a man, or might have been something merely pretending to be a man. Thunder boomed overhead as Morgan raised his lantern, squinting through the downpour. There was nothing there, just empty field. He should go back to the house, lock the doors, wait for morning. But instead, Morgan found himself moving forward, drawn toward the spot where he thought he'd seen the figure. The mud sucked at his boots as he walked, making each step an effort. Another flash of lightning, another glimpse of that tall figure, closer now. Not in the center of the field as he had first thought, but at its edge, near the tree line. Morgan's heart hammered in his chest. "Travis?" he called, his voice swallowed by the storm. "Is that you?" No answer, just the relentless drumming of rain and the moan of wind through the distant trees. He pressed on, feeling increasingly that he was being led somewhere. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, but a deeper instinct propelled him forward. He needed to know, needed to be sure. At the edge of the field, where tilled earth gave way to wild growth, Morgan's lantern illuminated a crude shelter built of fallen branches and what looked like pieces of old farm equipment. A lean-to, just tall enough for a man to stand in, its entrance darkly gaping. "Hello?" Morgan called, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" From within the shelter came a rustling sound, like straw shifting. Morgan raised his lantern higher, its beam penetrating the darkness of the lean-to. At first, he saw nothing. Then his light caught a splash of color against the far wall. Faded blue denim. Overalls. His uncle's overalls, now moldering with age and exposure. They weren't empty. Something filled them, a form that seemed to shudder at the light. It turned toward him with deliberate slowness, revealing what had once been burlap, but now looked sickeningly like weathered skin stretched over a skull-like face. No mouth, no eyes, just crude approximations, like a child's drawing made flesh. Morgan stumbled backward, nearly dropping his lantern. The figure didn't pursue him. but simply stood at the threshold of its shelter, head tilted in silent recognition. The longer Morgan stared, the more certain he became that the thing was somehow smiling without a mouth. He fled back to the house. Once inside, Morgan bolted the door and pushed a heavy cabinet in front of it for good measure. His hands trembled so badly he could barely manage another drink from the whiskey bottle. Outside, the storm raged on, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the yard. Each time, Morgan thought he caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the field, watching the house, watching him. He didn't sleep. How could he? Instead, he sat in Aunt Becky's chair, the lantern at his side, whiskey bottle depleted, waiting for dawn. When gray light finally began to seep through the windows, Morgan roused himself from his half-stupor. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. His head throbbed with hangover, but a chilling clarity had settled over his thoughts. Aunt Becky had lived here alone for years after Travis left. She must have known about Callum, must have found a way to coexist with the thing that lurked at the edge of her property. Morgan needed to know how. He began searching the house methodically, looking for anything that might explain how his aunt had managed all those years. In her bedroom, he found a small wooden box tucked beneath the bed. Inside were dozens of small charms and amulets, crude things made of twisted wire, dried herbs, and what looked like bone fragments. Beneath these lay a sealed envelope with his name written on it in Aunt Becky's familiar handwriting. Morgan's hands trembled as he opened it. Dear Morgan, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've come back to the farm. I prayed you never would. There are things you need to know about what happened that summer. I sent Travis away once that thing attacked you. I knew neither of you boys were safe. What I never told you was what happened 2 weeks later. I caught the scarecrow, Callum, as you boys named it, dragging an unconscious child through the field one night, a little girl who wandered away from her family at the county fair. I couldn't stop it. I tried. God knows I tried, but that thing was too strong. That night, I made a terrible choice. I decided to try to feed it, to keep it from hunting. I thought if I could satisfy its hunger, maybe it would leave the children alone. For years, I fed it farm animals, chickens at first, then rabbits and squirrels, eventually larger livestock. It worked, after a fashion. It stayed in the field, in the woods at the edge of our property. It didn't hunt beyond our boundaries as long as I kept it fed. Travis only returned once for a visit after college, but never again after that. He couldn't bear to be near the place, knowing what he had done. He drank himself to death a year later. The doctors called it liver failure, but I know it was guilt that killed him. I've kept the scarecrow fed all these years, but now that burden falls to you, Morgan. After all, it was you and Travis who created it. The sacrifices must be made monthly, during the dark of the moon. Nothing human. I've never crossed that line, thank God. But it needs blood, fresh blood, more as the years go by. I've tried to destroy it. Silver doesn't work. Fire only makes it angry. Holy water just seems to make it stronger somehow. I've consulted priests, witches, even a professor of folklore from the university. Nothing works. I'm sorry to leave you with this burden, Morgan. I truly am. But there's no one else. Sell the property if you must. But know this. If you choose to run, to ignore what I've told you, innocent blood will be on your hands. The scarecrow is patient, but it's always hungry. God forgive me for what I've done, and God help you for what you must do now. Your loving aunt, Becky. Morgan lowered the letter, a cold understanding washing over him. For 20 years, Aunt Becky hadn't been protecting the property from Callum. She'd been keeping it fed, desperately trying to prevent it from hunting children while searching for a way to destroy what he and Travis had created. A responsibility that now fell to him. His hands still trembling, Morgan reached for his phone and opened a news app, searching for Clearfield Missing. The results made his blood run cold. Over the past year, since Aunt Becky had entered the nursing home, 4 children had disappeared from the surrounding area. The first was a 7-year-old boy who had been riding his bike along the country road that passed near the farm. Then a 9-year-old girl who wandered away from a family picnic at the state park that bordered the property's backwoods. 2 months ago, 12-year-old twins had vanished while exploring an abandoned barn less than half a mile from where Morgan now stood. The articles described extensive searches, grief-stricken parents, and baffled police. No bodies found, no evidence. The children had simply vanished. Morgan scrolled through the photos of the missing children. Bright smiles, innocent eyes. He felt sick as he noticed the dates. Each disappearance had occurred almost exactly 1 month apart, the same rhythm as Aunt Becky's offerings. The most recent child had gone missing 3 weeks ago, which meant... Morgan looked toward the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting eerie shadows across the overgrown yard. Somewhere out in that field, Callum would be growing hungry again. A sudden thought struck him. The barn. The articles mentioned the twins had last been seen near an abandoned barn. Morgan knew that barn. It sat on the far side of Aunt Becky's property, at the edge of the woods. He and Travis had played there as children. Grabbing his lantern and a kitchen knife, a pathetic defense, but better than nothing, Morgan set out across the muddy yard. The sun was sinking rapidly now, painting the western sky in streaks of crimson that looked uncomfortably like blood. The old barn loomed against the darkening sky, its weathered boards silvery with age, roof partially collapsed. The large double doors hung askew on rusted hinges. One creaked slowly in the evening breeze. Surely the search team would have looked here, but Morgan approached anyway, cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he had to know, had to see for himself what Callum had done. The interior of the barn was thick with shadows, the air heavy with the sense of moldering hay and something else, a decayed rotting smell that made Morgan's stomach clench. He raised his lantern, its light cutting through the gloom. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the expected detritus of an abandoned structure. Rotting hay bales, rusted farm equipment, a collapsed workbench. But as he moved deeper into the space, his light fell upon something that didn't belong. A neat circle of children's shoes, 8 in total, 4 pairs, scattered around the center of the barn floor. Within the circle lay small mounds covered with tarps. Morgan knew what he would find beneath them, but he approached anyway, driven by a need to confirm the awful truth. With trembling hands, he lifted the edge of the nearest tarp. What lay beneath bore only the vaguest resemblance to a human child. The body had been twisted and torn, parts of it replaced with tightly bound straw. The face was the worst, still recognizably that of a young boy, but the eyes and mouth had been sewn shut with crude stitches, and tufts of straw protruded from the nostrils and ears. The child's chest had been opened and emptied, the cavity stuffed with more straw. Morgan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He dropped the tarp and turned away, but not before his lantern illuminated the other 3 bundles. Each contained similar horrors, children partially transformed, their bodies hollowed out and filled with straw, as if someone, something, had been experimenting, learning how to make more of its kind. As Morgan stumbled toward the barn door, desperate for fresh air, for escape, his lantern beam caught movement in the hayloft above. Something shifted in the shadows. A tall, thin figure, observing him with the stillness of a predator. Morgan ran. He burst from the barn into the twilight, not slowing until he reached the house. Once inside, he vomited repeatedly into the kitchen sink, his mind reeling with the images of those mangled children. When he could finally stand upright again, he noticed something on the kitchen table that hadn't been there before. A small burlap doll, crudely stitched, with button eyes and a drawn-on smile. A message, a warning. Callum had been in the house while Morgan was at the barn. That night, Morgan prepared to do what he should have done 20 years ago. From Aunt Becky's shed, he retrieved a can of gasoline. From her kitchen, a box of matches. From her bathroom, a small bottle labeled holy water. He wasn't sure if the holy water held any power, but Aunt Becky had been devout, and Morgan was desperate for any edge he could find. He waited until midnight. In the movies, midnight always seemed to be when such things should be done. In the pale moonlight that now broke through the dispersing clouds, Morgan made his way to the lean-to at the edge of the field. It was empty. He doused it with gasoline anyway, adding the clothes and scattered straw. Before lighting the match, he sprinkled the holy water over everything, and then stepped back and lit the match and tossed it into the straw. Flames leapt hungrily skyward. As the fire devoured the lean-to, Morgan thought he heard a sound beneath the crackling of flames, a high, thin keening, like wind through dried cornstalks, or like something in pain. Morgan then went to the barn and set it ablaze as well. Dousing the ancient timbers with gasoline, he watched as the fire consumed the weathered structure. The flames rose higher than those of the lean-to, turning the night sky orange. He stood witnessing the inferno until there was nothing left but smoldering ashes, the children's remains, and any evidence of Callum's atrocities seemingly purified by the cleansing fire. The next morning, Morgan returned to the field. Nothing remained of the lean-to, but a circle of ash and blackened earth. Of Callum, there was no sign. He went to the barn site as well, stilling himself for what he would find. Where the structure had once stood was now just a blackened rectangular foundation, smoking embers still hot in places. As he kicked through the ashes, he found melted bits of metal, perhaps belt buckles or snaps from clothing, but no recognizable remains of the horrors he had witnessed. The fire had been thorough, reducing everything to unidentifiable char. Yet Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that something had escaped before the flames had taken hold completely. 3 days later, Morgan signed the papers to sell the farm to a developer who planned to build a subdivision on the property. They would clear the fields, cut down the woods, erase all traces of what had happened there. As Morgan drove away from Clearfield for the last time, he caught a glimpse of something in his rearview mirror. A tall figure standing at the edge of the field, watching him go. But when he looked back, nothing was there. Just empty field stretching toward distant trees, waiting for the developers to come, waiting to be transformed. And so, dear listeners, we emerge from another dark corner of Carmen's crypt. But remember, the horrors you've heard tonight are merely echoes of the terrors that await in the shadows of your own mind. If you enjoyed your stay in the crypt, why not invite a friend to join us next week? After all, fear is best when shared. Leave a review if you dare, or share your own tales of terror on my social media. Who knows? Your nightmares might just become my next story. Until next time, keep checking under your bed. And remember, in Carmen's crypt, every fear comes alive, and no one is truly safe. Sweet dreams, if you can still sleep at all.